going on? So, as you know, this week we're talking about some poetry. We're talking about this one poet named Langston Hughes. And what I would love for you to do is to read an article from Newsella. That would be great. But maybe it's a little bit too difficult. So, what I want to do is read it to you. So, you'll have the text as always on the screen, and you'll have my voice. All you have to do is just sit back, relax, and take everything in. So we've watched the biography on Langston Hughes. You should know a little bit about him already. And then some of this will be repeat, which is good because hopefully you'll remember it even longer. And then some of it will be new. Excuse me. So synopsis. We've talked a little bit about this before. I think even like yesterday we talked about it, but a synopsis is like a snapshot of the entire article. And Newsella will do this quite a bit. So the synopsis, I mean, you should read the whole article, but the synopsis gives you a good summary of what you are about to read. So Langston Hughes was born in Joplin, Missouri in 1902. He is one of the most important writers and thinkers of the Harlem Renaissance. So hopefully that's not new. In the biography, we talked about where he was born. We talked about the Harlem Renaissance. So this is maybe the second time you're hearing this, maybe the third time. And then in case you didn't know what Harlem Renaissance is, the next sentence tells you. This was an artistic movement in the 1920s in New York that celebrated African-American life and culture. Through his poetry, novels, plays, essays, and children's books, Hughes promoted equality, condemned racism, and became a celebrated voice of Black culture, humor, and spirituality. So condemned is one of our words. Hopefully you have been studying those. Early years. Hughes's childhood was one of frequent change and exposure to people of many backgrounds. So frequent meaning happens often. Exposure just means you are introduced to them. He was born in 1902 in Joplin, Missouri, but his parents separated when he was very young. His father moved to Mexico, and his mother left him for long periods in search of steady employment. Hughes's grandmother raised him in Lawrence, Kansas until he was 12. He later lived with his mother and stepfather in Illinois and Ohio. Hughes began writing creatively in high school, exploring his experiences and feelings in poetry. The year 1921 was a pivotal one. Another one of our words, pivotal, like very important. We have two words from that list that mean important, and pivotal is one of them. So 1921 was a really important year for Hughes. He traveled to Mexico to be with his father and teach English in Mexican schools. While traveling on a train, he wrote his first significant poem. Significant also means important. So just another way to say it. Could have said pivotal poem probably right there, but they chose not to because they already used it over here. And I'm not going to say that in word. I just don't feel comfortable saying it, but we talked about that word in the biography video about that. So it was acceptable back in the 1920s, and I just don't feel comfortable saying it right now. The speaks of rivers. The poem was published in The Crisis, a magazine of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the leading civil rights organization in the United States. And if you ever see this, that's a mouthful to say, right? So you'll often see it written as the NAACP, the NAACP, NAACP. And if you don't know what that is, it's the leading civil rights organization in the United States. So they're kind of, we call them a watchdog, but they just make sure that people of color are being treated fairly. It begins, I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. That same year, Hughes attended Columbia University in New York and fell in love with the nearby neighborhood of Harlem. Although he remained at Columbia for only 1 year, his time there changed the direction of his life and art. He established friendships with other young African American writers who were part of Harlem's vibrant artistic scene. He met talented musicians and artists who would also influence his writing. Around this time, he also voyaged to Europe and Africa before returning to live in Washington, D.C. This is called growing recognition. We've talked about this before too. It's always important to read those subheadings because it's a way to organize the article. So I'm imagining in these next 3 paragraphs right here, we're going to be reading about him being recognized more. The mid-1920s saw Hughes grow in his talent. In 1925, while working as a hotel busboy, Hughes gave 3 of his poems to Vishal Lindsay. Who the heck is that? Well, a famous critic and poet. Lindsay's enthusiastic support introduced Hughes to a wider audience. Hughes's book about the blues and jazz music scene, The Weary Blues, was published in 1926. In an essay that same year in The Nation magazine, Hughes shared ideas that united a generation of African American thinkers, writers, and visual artists. We younger blank artists who create now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. If white people are pleased, we're glad. If they're not, it doesn't matter. We know we are beautiful. We build our temples for tomorrow, strong as we know how, and we stand on top of the mountain, free within ourselves. So here you can imagine in the 1920s, if you were black, if you were an artist, I'm pretty sure most of the big media was controlled by people who are white. So for the first time, maybe in American history, people of color are saying, we don't need a white audience. If they like it, great. But if not, we're just going to keep writing, and it doesn't matter, if the people in power don't really like it. We have our own community who's going to like it. Hughes traveled extensively and spent time living and working in Europe. Like many black writers of that period, he was interested in race relations and other nations and cultures. However, he always returned to Harlem, and the people and places there dominate his poetry and prose. We've talked about that, right? The difference between poetry and prose. Prose is just, I've used this book as an example before. Prose, it's paragraphs as opposed to stanzas. He also believed in using his art to share his beliefs about politics and justice as they impacted African American communities. All right, just looking through here, we have 2 more sections. So, man of the people and the arts, and death. Oh, spoiler alert, he's going to pass away. Hughes was interested in all walks of life, but he had a special place in his heart and art for the people he called the Lowdown Folks. He admired these working class, low-income families and friends because they accepted what beauty is their own without question. They appeared frequently in his works, and he used his poetry as a form of praise for their strength, style, and humor. Just want to make sure I was recording this. I thought this whole time for a second, I'm like, did I hit record? Luckily, I did hit record. Okay, back to the article. If I remember where I was. Hughes also loved African American styles of music, especially the blues. These are songs that express sad themes and heartbreak. In songs called The Blues, it was published in 1941, Hughes said this music was sung by black, beaten, but unbeatable throats. So the blues, as they said, often it's sad music. I should probably leave a couple links So you can listen to some famous blues players, maybe like Howling Wolf or B.B. King or some very popular blues musicians. So black beaten but unbeatable throats. So they had been through some hard times, but like they're not going to quit. Other forms of art influenced Hughes, and in turn, his work crossed over into other mediums. So when we talk about mediums here, it's often used with art. So if you're talking about art class here in this school, you might be talking about like painting or clay work or sketching with a pencil, but it can also be used as like music, poetry, paintings, things like that, including music. Hughes said that jazz and blues express the wide range of Black America's experience. In 1958, he recorded his poetry, accompanied by jazz artists. The rhythm of jazz also influenced his 1951 montage of A Dream Deferred, and we will be reading that poem, A Dream Deferred, it's called. This was a book-length poem in 5 sections depicting African Americans' experience in American cities. It combined music, poetry, and prose history. Uh-oh. No, I thought we were getting to the sad part. Close. Hughes also loved drama and plays and established theater companies in both New York and Los Angeles. Hughes wrote his first play, Mulebone, with Zora Neale Hurston in 1930 and kept writing for the stage the rest of his life. In order to make his plays sound more real to life, Hughes mixed the lyrical nature of his poetry with more natural dialogue. So let's talk about that for a second. And I hope you'll notice that as we go through his poetries. Sometimes poetry can be very difficult to read. Larger words twisted, I guess, for lack of a better term, in a poetic way. But Hughes's poetry oftentimes is a little more straightforward and more how we would speak, which is why it might be a little bit easier for us to read, because it's a lot like how we speak and not always like how poets write poetry. Death and legacy. Langston Hughes died in New York City in 1967 at the age of 65. He wrote right until the end of his life, and a collection of poems reflecting the racial politics of the 1960s was published after his death. Hughes influenced many people with his art. Young writers and artists continue to admire the poet and his works. African Americans especially have found in him an upbeat, hopeful voice for their own experiences and culture, a voice that has been widely shared a voice that had not been widely shared until Hughes shared his. All right, how do I get back here? I'm back. All right. I hope you enjoyed that. We will talk more about Langston Hughes and read a couple of his poems. Hope you enjoy it. I'm going to get out of here now.